Skyfall equals RK equals Part 10 equals RK equals Near KDYHQ, Kuwait, a nondescript truck came flying straight at Dini and the commandos carrying her. She allowed herself a moment of relief when she sensed the feigned presence of her master coming from the approaching machine, an emotion that was gone almost immediately after the sound of collapsing multi-kilometer building became deafening scream. The young Jedi dared look over her shoulder and her eyes widened. The upper part of the building was already in a complete collapse and even its reinforced structure couldn't keep it together any longer. Metal floors collapsed as if made of tinfoil, cut-bearing columns wavered, bent and finally broke, and the massive structure began tearing itself apart under gravity and its own weight even as it slid towards the ground. Soon it turned into a speeding avalanche of twisted metal, furniture and people whose screams were soon cut short. Dini and her carriers hit the truck hard and they barely took a grip on its side before it dived to outrun the collapse. A third commando managed to take hold, but the last was lost, cut down by concentrated fire from diving enemy soldiers, most of whom were both enraged at what was happening to their world and knew they simply weren't fast enough to make it to safety. That left them long enough to stabilize their descent and open fire. While Dini was somewhat safe thanks to the overlapping deflectors of the soldiers who carried her and the force, the other troopers weren't so fortunate. The last one who got to the truck had his defenses breached and his armor had gaping holes to prove how close he came to dying. Even now, the Jedi could feel his pain and the iron will required to keep holding on despite his wounds. The same could be said about her master, who was in the back of the truck, and going by what Dini could sense through their bond, his whole world was agony. Before she knew it, the truck got to safety just before the collapsing building could sweep them away. Even now she could sense the fury emanating from the Sith who were on the other side of the avalanche. From what she saw, they were at least as messed up as her master, which was good. The Jedi Knight doubted she was up to the task of getting away from them otherwise. The truck dived through a swarm of ascending vehicles and went into a long tunnel leading through a nearby commercial building. It slowed down so they could actually get inside, or so Dini thought. "We're getting off nearby. Get the commander," one of the commandos ordered. She crawled over the side of the truck until she got to the back door and used the force to open it. Inside she saw Master Perian strapped to a seat bolted along the left side with a tired Bothan trying to tend his wounds. A glance was enough to see that her master was deep into a healing trance, and the very fact that he was still in agony was telling. "I've done what I could, but he needs hospital, soon. You need to get him out of here," the Bothan medic said. The driver hammered over the thin sheet of metal separating him from the cargo compartment. 10 seconds. There's a platform on the right. She'll slow down so you can jump. There's a small freighter waiting on the far end of the building. We have a droid waiting to guide you there. Dini didn't waste any time. An exertion of her will snap the safety harness keeping her master in place, and she cocooned him into a telekinetic field before taking him in her hands and moving towards the exit. The truck slowed down, and when she saw the edge of the platform passing by, the Jedi made a force-assisted leap. The commandos followed using their rocket packs. The Jedi Knight didn't know it, but the truck would soon enter a large freighter preparing to leave with as many civilians as could cram inside before it had to lift off to outrun the crashing pieces of the array. The Kuwait Navy would be able to intercept and board that ship in search for Perian and his strike team. Meanwhile, the small freighter waiting for them would have slipped away, lost among thousands of craft racing to get away from the unfolding disaster. RK equals, make no mistake, this is the face of our enemy. To no one's surprise, now that there is no Sith leading them, the Separatists are the same. This isn't a war fought by an oppressed Outer Rim against the evil Republic. This conflict that has cost us tremendously is nothing less than a naked power grab. We don't fight for dominance of the core, not even for the ideal of the Republic. We all fight for something more basic and fundamental, for the right to make our own path in life and chart our destiny free from the murderous control of the Separatists. If they have their way, the Separatist would see us all in chains, toiling for their benefit. From an interview given by Anara Kuat, After a failed attempt to assassinate her during the Skyfall crisis, =RK=. For a week after Skyfall, the Republic was in disarray, almost rivaling the dark days following Chancellor Palpatine's assassination. Many wondered if this latest tragedy would mark the final collapse of the Republic, which was in dire straits despite the superhuman efforts of the Satine administration to put things to right. A large number of pundits predicted an imminent political collapse, one that was nonetheless averted, if barely if certain persistent rumors are to be believed. What we know for sure is that 4 days after Skyfall, multiple political and military leaders aligned with the Republic and its allies met on Coruscant behind closed doors. 3 days later, precisely 1 week after Skyfall, the Republic's response to the tragedy and claims that the war was all but lost came in the form of Operation Starhammer. The Separatists had been preparing for a general Republic offensive in the core ever since Admiral Trench took Corellia. Both sides had marshaled tremendous forces for a clash unseen since the New Sith Wars. Yet, even as Republic fleets and army groups under the personal command of General Kenobi prepared to retake Corellia, GAR High Command unleashed Starhammer, and the target of that operation caught off guard friends and enemies alike. Both the CIS and many Republic-aligned government and military officials believed that if the GAR launched any other major offensive besides the one aimed at the Confederate positions in the core, it would be to relieve Mandalore. It was a logical deduction considering that Satine Kenobi, the Chancellor who had dictatorial powers, was Mandalorian, and General Vale, one of the Republic's best of that era, was Mandalore himself. In fact, intelligence captured during Starhammer claims that a large part of the CIS strategic reserve was sent to lay a trap at Mandalore aimed at eliminating General Vale once and for all. So it came to a surprise when Starhammer's first targets were Rise of an Empire, Operation Starhammer, =RK=, Part 11, =RK=. There is little doubt that the Galactic Empire was engineered by the Sith. What many still argue, from the halls of power on Coruscant, Kuat, Alzakan, Eriadu and Naboo to cantinas all over the galaxy, is when and why General Vale became disillusioned with the Republic and arguably committed treason by working for its replacement with a working system, all the while he fought and bled to protect it. People close to the general were known to confide that it all began after his return to Coruscant as Mandalore, when instead of receiving a hero's welcome because of his actions at Geonosis or the role his planning had in saving lives at Mandalore during General Grievous' last offensive, he instead faced an inquisition in the Senate led by no other than future traitors to the Republic like the Jedi and senators from systems that seceded during our darkest hour, like Sylvaris. While it is widely known how that particular Senate hearing turned out, it is the belief of this author that the seeds of the Empire were born with the deals General Vale had to make in order to weather the storm. We know for a fact that he met with Chancellor Palpatine, the man widely believed to have been one of his political mentors, and a number of senators, the more notable of whom are Skywalker, née Amidala from Naboo, Organa from Alderaan, Mon Mothma from Chandrila and Bel Iblis from Corellia. Later events can help us deduct some of the deals made behind closed doors. It was no accident that after the Crimson Affair, upon his arrival at Naboo, Vale engineered the creation of the Mid-Rim Alliance, even if most histories give credit to Admiral and later, Moff Wilhuff Tarkin. There's a little doubt that the alliance would have been stillborn without the backing of General Vale. The reveal of secret weapons factories in the Chandralan system during the Troubles are often claimed as the price for Senator Mothma's backing. There were 3 pillars upon which General Vale built his political power. First were his people, the Mandalorians. Even as the world where their culture originated was under siege and burning, Mandalorians all over the galaxy moved with a new purpose. Many took up arms and headed home to fight as warriors. However, arguably, those who helped their people and the general the most were the Mandalorians, who fought with words and credits instead of arms. By the time Operation Starhammer was underway, over 30 worlds in the Mandalorian sector alone had Mandalorians work together, consolidate and take power, often completely legally and with backing from the local populations. Those people and the worlds they wrestled control of would serve as the backbone that made the recovery of Mandalore possible, as well as the cradle that birthed the resurgent Mandalorian civilization. The second pillar of the general's political power was the Mid-Rim alliance he helped establish and fought a bloody campaign to secure. The third, well, that one surprised the galaxy as a whole and as far as anyone but a conspiracy theorist would tell you, wasn't of his own making. In fact, the only reason General Vale managed to win himself such wide support and backing from Kuat was the fortune of war at its finest. He was at the right place at the right time, and when he saw an opportunity, he grabbed it with both hands and ran with it. Rise of an Empire, Operation Star Hammer =RK CIC, Republic Cruiser Victory, Dry Dock Sigma 3, KDY Array, Kuat. The first time anyone knew something was wrong was when the alarms came online. Those working outside the ship felt the deck below them vibrate. However, for the people deep inside Victory, it was Vicky's announcement that made them aware the sky was falling. Battle stations. All crew and support personnel, secure for emergency deployment. I repeat, all crew and support personnel, secure for emergency deployment. Vicky, report. Admiral Holt bolted from the captain's seat from where she was overseeing a training simulation for the skeleton crew currently on board. There was a massive explosion on the array, Admiral. The facility is on a high alert and the fleet will be locking down the whole system ASAP. All ships that cannot leave in case of an attack or further sabotage if this wasn't an accident. I'm coordinating with the engineers to either clear the dry dock or come on board, whatever is practical before I launch. You heard her. Look alive, people. I want us patched in both array security and the fleet alpha channel. If the separatists come to visit, I want to know the moment they drop from hyperspace. We might find ourselves into a battle any moment now and will need something to shoot with. I want status on our munitions. Yesterday, Joanna began issuing orders. The crew was still busy locking down the ship for immediate deployment when another tremor ran through the whole array, and this time it could be felt on the CIC. There was another explosion, 1,000 clicks spin-ward from the first. Vicky's holographic avatar blinked in shock. The array has been compromised. Emergency launch is authorized. I've just received confirmation. Planetary Defense Command issued Case Omega. Planetary shields are coming online. We're being patched into Fleet Command channels. With the array compromised, Admiral Sanchez on the shield is assuming command of the Quati fleet. Ma'am, you're the highest-ranked GAR officer in system. The main holotank showed images from array security, a direct camera feed from an intact part of the installation showing the inner ring of the massive station ringing the planet. An expanding shock wave rippled over a segment of the facility, and in the far corner of the image another one could be seen. It soon became clear that a huge chunk of the array had been torn off it as it began tumbling through space. A tiny in comparison ship went for intercept, and it wasn't until Vicky helpfully put a label to it that Joanna finally comprehended the scale of the unfolding disaster. That ship was Defender, a KDY build star dreadnought that was over 8 kilometers long, yet it was looked absurdly tiny compared to the broken piece of the array. Patch me through to all Republic naval elements in system. This is Admiral Joanna Holt, on the Victory. I'm assuming command of all GAR elements in system. Primary objectives at this time are defending against possible separatist incursion, preventing debris from the array from hitting Kuat if at all possible, and executing SAR operations. Admiral Holt, out. Vicky, how long before we're ready to launch? My hyper-matter reactor is cold. Under fusion power we won't have FTR capability, however I have enough juice for propulsion, shields and what weapons I can shoot with current ammunition stocks. ETA 3 minutes for emergency cold start. No one commented that doing so would shave off at least a few years from the engine's life. Time until the dock is clear of personnel? Joanna asked. Once the engines went online, anyone unlucky to be outside would either fry from the heat or radiation, even those who for one reason or another had environmental suits on. It took a lot of energy to move something like a Victory Star destroyer, and a lot of it unleashed in such a confined space would turn it into a crematorium. 5 minutes. Vicky helpfully reported. Unless there's another explosion or enemy forces arrive in system, we're launching in 5 then. If any of those happens, Don't wait for verbal command but get us out immediately, Vicky. The Admiral ordered. Aye, ma'am. Vicky's avatar saluted smartly. There is no trace of her usual cheek nor her peppy attitude. Admiral, I'm collating data from all available sources. There have been multiple reports of terrorist strikes all over the planet a few minutes prior to the explosions on the array. Just as they happened, there was a reported attack upon KDY HQ planetside. There are unconfirmed reports of a Jedi leading the attacks. Vicky paused. Scratch that. I'm intercepting Alpha channel call between the Defender and SHIELD. General Vale executed orbital drop leading a Marine battalion towards KDY HQ shortly before the array was compromised. My conclusion is that there is at least one Jedi strike team down there and the General is moving to intercept. And once again he goes to have all the fun and leaves me behind. Bo-Katan muttered from nearby. Joanna glanced to the left and saw the younger woman take a free seat at the weapons control station. Trust me, from what I saw of his antics, you're better off up here. As far as he doesn't get himself killed. There were no more explosions nor surprises in orbit, and the Victory managed to leave her dock without having to fry some of the engineers who helped build her. That was as far as good news went. With no ammunition to speak of, her only armaments were the Guardian system laser cannons, which were woefully underpowered for the task of dealing with a continent-sized chunk of armored stations that was now busy hitting the atmosphere. Emergency channels planetside are going crazy. Even I'm having trouble make up heads and tail of them. Vicky was providing the best overview of the situation she could. While in orbit, elements of the fleet were moving to save as many people from the falling chunk and at the same time tearing at it with their weapons and trying to slow it down with tractor beams. On the ground, everyone was busy running or going to any shelter that could survive the impact if it didn't land too close. The bad news though was that the KDY building was collapsing and Vicky had no idea if her father had made it out intact. She hadn't felt so helpless in her short life, nor did she feel so angry at anything before. That day, as the place of her birth burned, Victoria learned to hate. == Defender herself could have turned 1,000 square kilometers of rock into a molten lake in a short order. When backed by the ships of the Quati Navy that responded to the unfolding tragedy, they could have sterilized unprotected planet within a few hours using turbo lasers alone, faster with the help of concussion missiles. 1,000-kilometer-long piece of the KDY array, on the other hand, there was more tonnage contained in there than a significant chunk of the whole Republic Navy, and it wasn't built to commercial standards. That very fact did help, otherwise the whole array would be already shredding itself. On the other hand, millions of megatons, many of them warship-grade armor, and a lot of it, were falling towards the planet. Even as spreads of missiles tore chunks of the broken array and turbo lasers boiled away hundreds of tons worth of armor and tractor beams tried to slow it down, it kept on going. The good news for Kuat was that the planetary shields did come online soon, followed by theater ones all over the planet. The bad one, however, was that reaction times were slow. When the piece slammed into the defensive screen, it was far from full power. The sheer kinetic impact released gigatons upon gigatons of power that vaporized a significant part of the broken station and finally shattered it into million pieces. That, however, was too much for still charging shield, and it suffered a partial collapse in the strained area. Molten metal and chunks of malformed and twisted station fell all over a whole hemisphere like a demented orbital bombardment. It was there where the theater shields paid for themselves in the span of few minutes, as whole cities and billions would have perished without them. Yet, many of them were still charging too, and more than a few had to tank impact of metal shards larger than the biggest star dreadnought that KDY ever built. Some shields survived even that punishment, if barely. Those were the ones whose crews were fasted to bring them online and their maintenance personnel had everything working perfectly. Others, well, there was no one left alive after megatons worth of metal punctured them and slammed within their protective bubble. The only saving grace there was that before said shields failed completely, they contained most of the fury of the kinetic death. When the skies stopped falling, over 300 million Quati citizens were gone, with more soon to join them from secondary effects. equals RK equals Doc Alpha, Republic Cruiser Victory, low orbit over Kuat, an assault shuttle touched down just for long enough for us to disembark. Couple of survivors of the doomed battalion I led helped me and Zash to get off faster while a few others dragged a load of shocked civilians out. The moment we were clear, the shuttle turned around on its repulsors and shot back towards the burning hemisphere below. Medics rushed to check on us while a small smattering of clone troopers and Quati security tried their best to keep the order. A medic ran a scanner over me before pressing a Bacta injector to my neck and pumping the healing substance into my bloodstream. Another injector sent a warm and calming sensation through me, painkillers. I paid the man little to no attention. I was too busy watching another world burn, and this time I had hard time keeping my conscience at bay. For the first time in a long while I wondered what the criff I was even doing and why I did it. The way the dark side criffed me over down there was exquisite, and under different circumstances I could appreciate a well-done treachery. Here and now. I hadn't been this furious since Ashara died in my hands, but this wasn't a hot all-consumed fury. Instead, it was a cold and calculated. My conscience kept nagging at me, claiming that this was my fault. After all, I did my best to escalate this war and make it a real one, and along with Parian's maniacs, I was the only other person in this whole criffing galaxy besides Zash who had any idea what that really meant. Worlds burned to ashes, the dying screams of trillions echoing through the Force, and with the way the dark side acted today, I might very well add the laughter of thirsting gods too. All I should be seeing in this tragedy should have been an opportunity to advance my agenda. Instead, I remembered a beautiful blue sphere that I fought to prevent from burning. I remembered clearly the man I used to be before he died at the Sith Academy on Korriban for the monster who I was today to emerge, and was disgusted at what I saw and did. The worst thing, I couldn't see a better way to bring this madness I helped bring into existence to an end without playing my role to the bitter end. The Republic under Satine was currently kept in line, at least in part, by the fear of Sith reprisal. Of more worlds burning at my hand, yet the idea now made me want to puke. At the same time, the dark side was right beside me, offering me her poisonous gifts. It would be so easy to make my weakness go away and put my conscience aside. Right there, that big fire. That's my home. My sister's behind. A young voice trembled nearby. More than one person was crying as they watched their homes burn. "Father, are you all right?" Vicky's familiar voice came from behind me. I finally turned away from the shielded doors of the hangar and looked deeper into the cavernous hold. Vicky's hollow image hung behind me, and she looked critically at me. "Mother's on her way. She was worried about you. Pissed off too, though from what I see I'm glad she was up here, safe." "Vicky, contact Task Force Red. Have them bring their acclimatros here to help evacuation efforts. Have GAR provide immediate support and dispatch assault ships and supplies, on my authority. I'm sure Kenobi and Satine will be doing the same once they're aware exactly how bad it is. Contact whoever is in charge and assure them that help is coming. Kuat won't stand alone in its hour of need." That was all I wanted to do, help and soothe my conscience. Yet, doing just that would solve nothing. I had a role to play still. This war had to end before the whole galaxy was set afire. "I'm doing it right now, Father," Vicky responded crisply. I ground my teeth at that thought and wondered how many worlds I would have to burn to end the war I began. "Once we have a handle of the situation, contact all surviving members of Kuat's government and military. We need to make sure the separatists won't be into a position to capitalize on this nor make a repeat performance." Choices. When all was said and done, it all came up to choices. I could not take advantage of this situation, I guessed. According to some, that would be the moral thing to do. On the other hand, doing anything but my best to end the war. How many more people would die needlessly unless I played the role I chose for myself so long ago? I felt the presence of my wife approach, and a part of the tension gripping me receded. Bo strode until she was in front of me and gave me a once-over. She frowned at my ravaged appearance and gently brushed her fingers under the lower part of my face. "You're a mess. I'll live." Beau's eyes softened. I could feel her worry and relief at seeing me more or less in one piece. She came closer and gave me a gentle hug, trying not to aggravate whatever wounds I had under my brutalized armor. "This is worse than what Grievous did to Mandalore," my wife muttered after glancing through the open hangar doors. "We'll end this and make them pay," I vowed. I was hypocrite. Once this was all over, I should be standing a trial right along with the separatist leadership. If we can bring them to justice, that is. With this blow, we might now lose the war, but pushing to a complete victory? That might be beyond what was left of the Republic. We stood there, staring at the burning Kuat as more and more shuttles came up to disgorge rescued survivors, something that repeated itself throughout the fleet. There had to be a lot of space on the array, but I had no doubt that the whole station was under lockdown and would remain that way for the foreseeable future. I could still feel the echo of the millions who died here today, as well as the pain of the billions suffering. I enjoyed every moment of it all, and that made me sick. The dark side laughed at the back of my mind the whole time. Thirsting gods indeed, the seeds of an empire. RK equals, Part 1. RK equals, Chancellor's office, Senate building, Coruscant. The view from the window behind her desk was breathtaking. Even the shadow thrown by a Venator cruiser that hung above the Senate to dissuade any and all further attempts to attack the building, or at least evacuate her if the worst happened, again. Chancellor Satine Kenobi sat in a sinfully comfortable chair, sipped from a cup of strong spiced tea and reminiscented. She would remember the past week until the day she died. Until now, if someone asked her when she killed the Republic, she would have to think long and hard. In all honesty, there were a lot of events that led her further and further down the path of being a dictator in anything but name. The easy answer would have been the day she was elected, or better say, appointed as Chancellor. However, in the weeks that followed, there were chances to bring back democracy to the Republic if only she was ready to damn her people for it. It was funny concept, freedom. Democracy too, for that matter. Many member worlds that made up the Republic were democratic in one stripe or another. As many were monarchies, theocracies, corporate conglomerates, and even theocracies and everything in between. The Republic was a noble goal. It used to inspire respect and awe in her when she was young. Then one bright day she came to Coruscant as the ambassador of her people and saw the Republic for what it really was. It was democratic on paper, sometimes indeed too, and that precisely was the problem. There were at least 1 million notable worlds in the Republic, though not all of them had their own senators. Some did represent individual planets, but others whole systems and even sectors. And every single one of them had its own problems, politics, rivals, enemies, and of course interests. Those members didn't exist to serve the Republic. Their senators weren't elected or appointed to act for the betterment of all. The Republic's function was to serve the interests of its members, and those were always contradictory. On a good day. The bitter truth was that some within the Republic were more equal than others. Many feared her people's reputation and history, especially now that they had a new and powerful Mandalore to lead them. No matter what people said in public, those who cared about what happened outside their neighborhood were few and far between. That included governments too. It was when Satine understood how the Senate really worked, how the core powers ran things behind the scenes and were content to profit from the war at the expense of the mid and outer rim territories, even their rivals in the core, or especially their rivals in the core, that she conceived the plan that ultimately led her to sit in this chair. To this day she wondered how Palpatine managed to run the whole circus as well as he did, and she had to remind herself that he had spent decades of building contacts and alliances, figuring out where the bodies were buried so he could blackmail people, and of course there was good old-fashioned bribery. Politics was a dirty, corrupted business, and it was nowhere more dirtier than in the Senate on Coruscant. It was necessary too. Every day before breakfast, Satine had to deal with 100 problems that, if left to fester, would undermine the Republic she ran. There were many worlds that weren't content with the status quo and hadn't seceded or even joined the Confederacy only because of their location or the fact that their populations were too divided on the issue. Both kinds had to be handled carefully and constantly watched. Some did require to have forces on hand in case elements of their system defense navies went rogue. Then there were the elements that outright seceded, and Satine still wasn't convinced that those willing to work with her government anyway weren't more dangerous than the openly hostile ones. Those two groups had to be watched and managed too, which was one of the main reasons why Obi-Wan was yet to launch the operation to liberate Corellia and push the Separatist out of the core. Another was the constant negotiations with thousands of systems to release a significant number of their SDFs for offensive operations. Some files recovered from the late Chancellor's archives helped in that regard. Promises and pressure by Satine's allies did their part, but the rest was up to her. It was all those deals that were necessary to continue fighting the war and ultimately secure Mandalore that murdered the Republic. She couldn't have done half the work without the power of a dictator concentrated in the office. She could understand both why Palpatine needed it to make the Republic work and why everyone was afraid of anyone having this much power. They were afraid it would be used against them. And Satine had little choice but do it. Every time made the next a little bit easier. Every contradictory deal meant that another piece of the Republic died, not to mention that everyone knew that she couldn't possibly honor all the promises she made. That's why thousands upon thousands of worlds were jockeying for the ear of her regime at the expense of their rivals. They wanted to be on the winning side when the war ended and the new order got formalized. Bitter laughter escaped Satine's lips. No wonder so many systems eagerly joined the Separatists. In their shoes, she might have done the same. For a moment she wondered when the Republic went wrong. After all, it achieved an unprecedented era of prosperity. The answer was of course obvious: there was the price to be paid for said prosperity, and the fact was that the ones who saw most of it were the systems of the core. Those who joined the Separatists, while the Republic's fabled Golden Age was built by draining most of them dry of resources to fuel it. Now that they were finally strong enough to do something about it and the Republic itself had grown decadent and weak enough to give them an opportunity, was it any wonder that they seized it? Satine sipped her tea and brought her thoughts back together. It took everything she and the institutions of the Republic government to keep an illusion going. As far as most common citizens were concerned, it was back to business as usual on Coruscant. Those who knew better or simply feared her Mandalorian heritage, most of them already seceded, joined the Confederacy or were closely watched. Every bloody day it was more of the same backbreaking work needed to keep things running. Then with a single stroke everything changed and the House of Cards came perilously close to tumbling down. If it hadn't been for the efforts of countless people on Coruscant and beyond, it would have happened months ago, and yet, now despite all their efforts, it was almost all for naught. It all came back to Kuat. Oh, how she learned to hate that name. The political ramifications of what the press coined as Skyfall were borderline disastrous, even if the military ones wouldn't be really felt until few months to years down the line. Time in which the loss in production capacity could be made inconsequential or the war lost for all intents and purposes. One of the primary rules of politics was that they were at least as much about perception as reality. For months now the Republic had been suffering blow after blow, and even Vale's return and his successful campaign in the Mid-Rim had been a mixed blessing at best. This new disaster put everything on the line. Satine sipped her tea again and paused her thoughts to savor the taste. 7 days ago, disaster struck. 7 days ago, she had to work like a demon to keep everything together, and when things began to slip through her clenched fingers, it was Vale of all people who came to the rescue along with Anara Kuat to rub salt into the wound. It was him who called that meeting between the major powers of the core. It was his presence and words that convinced them that his plan could stave off disaster. And it was she, Satine Kenobi, who sealed the final death of the Republic with her own hands when she signed off on the plan and the deals made during that meeting. The price to pay, neither she nor a democratic republic could pay it. A formalized dictatorship, however, an empire even, one where those people ran from the shadows with her as a figurehead, such a future could give them what they wanted. Satine put a hand on her growing stomach. Those people would use her, one day they would use her unborn daughter too. Or so they thought. The Chancellor and future Empress smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. None of them bar her husband knew the truth of the deal she cut with Vale, Zash, and Kuat. In the fullness of time, she would rule, not reign. She wouldn't be a pawn to the same people who would gleefully throw her people to the wolves when it served their purposes. Satine began quietly singing a lullaby, the same one her mother sang to her and Bo what felt like an eternity ago, and remembered what exactly led to this moment. RK equals. In a war full of history-shaping events, few are as important, yet rarely acknowledged as the Coruscant Summit. That event happened 4 days after the Skyfall, with the meat of it unfolding on the 6th one after a series of smaller meeting and negotiations between the various delegates. A lot of historians speculate that the second day of the summit served a single purpose, to show unity and merely formalize the various deals already made. The military effects of the Coruscant Summit couldn't be understated, though they're covered in another part of this book, Operation Starhammer. What we will dissect at length here are the arguably more important aspects, the political ones. The Coruscant Summit is hailed as the time and place where the then Chancellor Satine Kenobi laid the foundations of the future Galactic Empire. While she had already been enjoying close to dictatorial powers, she didn't seek them in the first place but merely inherited them from Chancellor Palpatine, the one man the galaxy trusted with that much power. In fact, it was the fear of his successor misusing the power invested in the Chancellor's office that was one of the primary reasons why the Senate remained locked down into inaction after Chancellor Palpatine's assassination. If it wasn't for that situation arising in the first place, it was unlikely that Satine Kenobi would have tried to gain the post of Chancellor. In fact, as a Mandalorian ambassador, and remember, at that time Mandalore wasn't a Republic member, it was strictly speaking impossible for her to gain said office in the first place. As people say, necessity is mother of invention. Satine Kenobi needed a working Senate, and thus Republic Gar naval forces could be made available to lift the siege of her homeworld of Mandalore, so she made the necessary deals, gained support and herded along enough local governments that it became viable to sidestep the Senate and elect a Chancellor directly. A most controversial step that led to a number of systems seceding in protest. Many an author saw that step as the first towards reunifying the galaxy and ultimate power, something very much not in character according to those who knew Satine Kenobi prior to her arrival to Coruscant, and thus we come full circle, back to the Skyfall and the Coruscant Summit, which was its direct consequence. In the days following those tragic events on Kuat, Chancellor Kenobi personally met with members of the Kuati government and KDY Corporation, notably Anara Kuat. During that perilous period, she was known to consult and work closely with General Vale in his persona as Mandalore and her husband, General Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Supreme Commander of the Republic military. Those are the people universally hailed or vilified, depending on where you stand, as the founding mothers and fathers of the Galactic Empire. Rise of an Empire, the Accidental Empress and the Coruscant Summit. RK equals, Part 2, RK equals, Chancellor's Office, Senate Building, Coruscant. It all began one fine morning a week ago. The sun was shining, because it still wasn't high up enough to hide behind the cruiser hanging above the Senate. Flocks of military transports flew all over the place, either patrolling or bringing in senators and their aides, and a small army of aides burdened with data pads waited for the Chancellor's attention. The most important of them, Satine's personal assistant, brought her a fresh pots of kaf and her favorite teal along with medicine to soothe her stomach. What new disasters we have to deal with today? The Chancellor didn't know it, but she would be regretting those words not 10 minutes later. Military-related issues first. More unrest on Castay. The military governor requests at least 2 more battalions of military police or an infantry regiment so he could properly secure the place. It took Satine a few moments to place the name. Castay was one of the original separatist-aligned worlds within the core, and along with Skako the Confederacy had managed to turn the place into a fortress that didn't fall until Obi-Wan became Supreme Commander of the military. The locals were proud, had long military tradition financed by their close ties with the Commerce Guild. In fact, the current president, Shumai, one of the more influential leaders of the Confederacy, hailed from that world. Finally, breaking its defenses was a political coup that helped lessen the political blow of the Jedi treason. On the downside, the industry and lot of the infrastructure across the whole system were wrecked, unemployment was rampant, and the newest and most favorite pastime of the locals was bombing and taking potshots, and the Republic garrison tasked with holding down the place. Place said request on my to-do list when I speak with General Kenobi this afternoon. Next? Needless to say, that planet, in fact, the whole system had to be held down for various reasons. The usual suspects. Argao is rattling sabers along with their whole clique. At that news, Satine felt a headache beginning to form, and this was just the start of her day. During the chaos following the Jedi coup, the Argao mercenary military went rogue, no doubt under the direction of the director of the Bank of Argao. They politely surrounded the guard detachments on planet, put a warship in orbit above their heads, and then kindly asked them to comply with one of the 3 absolute local laws: disarm, leave, or face the punishment for being non-locals carrying weapons, death. Technically, that system along with those nearby was still aligned with the Republic. In practice, considering their close ties with the banking clans and how unreliable all of those unofficially were, that whole sector of space was under a distant blockade, and a powerful Republic naval detachment hang in the area in case the locals got uppity and threw their lot with the separatists. Either that or went on a restore the Republic crusade. Ideally, Satine would have loved to have that ulcer upon her Republic gone for good, however she lacked good options to deal with them. As long as Argao was technically still loyal, using the military against them was out of the question, and all the political pressure she could bring upon them wasn't enough to make them cave. The locals were still quite furious at the Republic landing troops there to secure their world from separatist incursion, which was an excuse and everyone knew it. The truth was that neither Palpatine nor the Guard trusted them farther than any of them could throw a Star Destroyer. The troops were there to keep them in line, and now Satine had to deal with the fallout. Argao wasn't alone. There were a lot of similar systems that her people had to closely watch in case either their civilian government or military acted up, and only some of those officially seceded from the Republic. In fact, the latter were the simplest to handle, either the threat of blockade, outright blockade, and all the political pressure that could be brought to bear to keep them sticking to their neutrality, or if at all possible negotiate a return to the fold. The real problem were the number of systems that were loyal in the very technical of senses, because they saw no other acceptable option even if they hated Satine and her government. In fact, the next part of the briefing was about to cover the most notable stunts that group pulled off since last night. Satine took a sip of caf and waved for her military aide to continue his briefing. He was just over the highlights, nothing too surprising if downright troublesome anyway, when the calms of various aides came to life, soon followed by her own. What followed were 24 hours of sheer madness, with only caf and stimulants keeping the Chancellor awake. The only highlight of the whole mess was that for once Vale turned out to be helpful and started the ball rolling on getting as much aid to Kuat as possible. Satine should have known the other shoe was about to drop, and that indeed happened soon after she came awake after 6 hours of medically prescribed sleep, while Obi-Wan and her government managed to keep the galaxy from imploding, if barely. What she awoke to were a great many nervous governments, civilians and pundits alike crying that the end was night, and Vale having an idea. The Chancellor should have known that it was Vale who would cause the most chaos and headaches, but at the time, she was just glad that someone had a rough plan how to stave off disaster before the Republic managed to finally fly apart. Arcade equals. There were protests already, small ones thankfully, and just the crazies so far. That was more than enough for Obi-Wan to get into even more of an overprotective mode, and Commander Rex was back along with a whole regiment to further boost the already impressive security at and around the Senate. It was too bad that none of those nice troopers could help her deal with the political fallout. Ever since the Jedi coup, to a large extent even before it too, but then Palpatine somehow kept the problems down to a saner level. The largest issue the Republic had wasn't strictly speaking military, even if the Cis had some notable advantages. It was political instability, and that particular can of worms had been wide open ever since her predecessor managed to get himself assassinated. Satine looked tiredly at her guests, Obi-Wan, who sat stiffly on the other side of her desk instead of hugging her like both of them wanted, Bail Organa, Padme Amidala, and the new senator from Alzakan. The previous one resigned shortly after the last attack upon this very building. My government has concerns that I was instructed to bring to your attention in person. The career diplomat began. By all means, do so. Satine wondered if there was anyone who didn't see through her fake smile. She had been awake for just an hour now, and this was the third such meeting with one of the major allies who made it possible for her to be chancellor, and their backing kept the Republic running. Or at least the illusion that the Republic as people knew it still existed, which was actually more important nowadays. We've seen the preliminary reports of lost shipbuilding capacity at the KDY array. The damage on the surface has been substantial too. To speak bluntly, my government now has substantial doubts in the Republic's capacity to prosecute this war to a successful resolution. They wanted someone to take the blame to, and Satine was the perfect woman for the job. Everyone so far had been ready to volunteer her to fall upon her sword. Well, everyone but her husband, but that was kinda expected. While the loss of partially complete warships and industrial capacity is concerning, it won't affect the war in the short term. The earliest we'll feel it is 6 months, when the first of those ships was slated to come online. Obi-Wan spoke first. 6 to 12 months, and then the effects of ships that wouldn't be built would double and so forth if the war was still ongoing in 2 or 3 years. The longer the time, the more pronounced and cumulative said effects. In the short term, however, military speaking, they weren't any worse than before the Skyfall. The military advisors of her allies had to know this as well, yet their senators kept coming to her. The conclusion was obvious since the very beginning. Strictly speaking, their concern wasn't military, or at least not primary military. It was one more blow in a series of crippling disasters that had them running scared. The CIS changing their leadership, overhauling their military command, and suddenly becoming much more dangerous was bad enough. Their grand offensive, and it did warrant the capital letters given its success, was worse. The Jedi coup and its consequences, Vale's stunts, and the impossibility of throwing him to the wolves. Those all combined into a political fuel waiting for a spark to ignite an explosion, and the Skyfall threw a burning flare into the mix. An increasing number of regular citizens and, more importantly, politicians were losing faith that the war could be won, especially at a price they would find acceptable. That was the primary concern for the latter category. Everyone wanted the CIS defeated, they just didn't want to be the ones to pay the price, so they could be in a better position for when the dust settled and it was time to reshape the political balance in the core for decades to come. Those were her allies too, and they at least were more or less consistent. All other governments, even thinking about the convoluted mess that were their politics and interests, made her head pound. And she missed what the good senator said. That wasn't a good sign at all. I can assure you, despite the latest setback, we're perfectly capable of overcoming everything the separatists can throw at us. Our military hasn't been in a better shape since the war began. Not a lie, strictly speaking, it was just that a lot of forces were tied down securing the core from possibly unreliable friendly elements and CIS deep strikes. Political and economic consolidation continues at better than expected speed. I can assure you, we'll keep our end of the bargain with your government. Which was hopefully what really the senator wanted to hear, just like those who came before him. I'll require more assurances than your word, I'm afraid, assurances that Satine couldn't give without lying through her teeth for a simple reason. 2 of the previous meeting were with people who had agendas that was at least in part conflicting with what Alzakan wanted, and she would be meeting 5 more such representatives before noon today. Lying through her teeth it was then, if not to the good senator sitting in front of her desk and sipping expensive Corellian brandy, then to those who even now waited to meet her. Curiously, no one ever commented that, strictly speaking, what Alzakan and many of Satine's other allies wanted wouldn't fly if put to the vote through a democratic Senate. Alzakan wanted to regain the prestige, authority and economic power it wielded before losing the conflict it had with Coruscant for leadership in the core. Giving them what they wanted would amount to significant economic concessions and a voice in running things with weight that many others would find unacceptable. There was no amount of pressure and bribes Alzakan's government alone could bring to bear to push something equivalent through the Senate. However, If they had Satine's backing and she persuaded some of her other key allies to help, then it might be just possible. Doing so would just require criffing over a number of both allies and currently neutral systems, and Satine had little choice but use her best diplomatic skills to persuade the senator that she would do her best to ensure Alzakan would get what it wanted. Just like she did during her previous meetings. The presence and tactic agreement of both Senators Organa and Skywalker merely gave gravitas to her promises. Satine always knew that the deals she made to gain the post and give her people a fighting chance would come home to roost. She simply didn't expect it to be this soon. Unless she found a way to change things, all she was doing was merely patching up a sinking ship, and not fast enough at that.